of the capital flows management measures and the macroprudential measures. And today, Ali will talk about macroprudential measure still implemented, effective, and what conditions that make it effective. So Ali, the floor is yours now. You will have around 40 to 45 minutes to present your paper, and then I will present, and at the end I will open for the floor for the Q&A sessions. So Ali, the floor is yours now.
Thank you very much, Vic, for the kind introduction. So, and thank you very much for having me here. It's an honor for me to be speaking in front of you guys. As Dick already mentioned earlier, that the talk today is about conditions for effective macroprudential policy interventions. This is one of the background papers that we did for the B chapter of the Asian Development Outlook 2018 update, which focuses on the issue of maintaining macroeconomic stability amid heightened uncertainty in the global economy in particular. So, I don't know how to address you, probably Dr. Chutatik perhaps. So, contributed on a very nice paper on assessing capital control measures in helping to maintain macroeconomic stability in the region. And then we have another paper on macroprudential policy interventions here. So these two less conventional, determined as less conventional macro policy levers that can be tapped in by the authorities around the region are part of the focus of attention when we discuss about available policy options for authorities around the region to deal with these uncertainties that they are facing. So in this paper, I will be discussing about MPP, macroprudential policy. It has been shown in the literature, quite a number of work has been done so far. Most of them are appearing in Journal of Financial Stability. Some of them are appearing in some other journals, which basically do some empirical assessment about whether or not macroprudential policy is effective in affecting credit growth or asset prices in different places of the world. Now, the main conclusion so far out of those studies are very uniform. Basically, most of the analysis found that macroprudential policy is effective in affecting those two indicators. But the question that comes forward is how effective are they in affecting credit growth and or asset prices? And then if they are effective, are they always effective? And are there factors that also can affect the effectiveness of such policies? These are three questions that has not, at least as far as my knowledge goes, has not been really discussed in the literature. The literature so far has been discussing these issues by taking either credit growth or economic growth in some cases, or asset prices at the left-hand side variable of their regressions, and then they put in measures of macroprudential policy interventions on the right-hand side as a control, one of the control variables, and see if the macroprudential policy intervention indicator comes up significant in the regression results. Most of them found that it comes up significant, and hence they conclude that these policies are effective in affecting the target indicators that they are getting in. So that's where the literature comes forward about the conclusion of effective macroprudential policy intervention. But when we revisit this thing for the ADO, we started asking ourselves a question. Okay, they are effective, but how effective? And are they always effective? And stuff like that. The three questions that I mentioned earlier. Unfortunately, the data set that is available so far is we didn't find that those data set is adequate to answer or to help us get some insights about the questions we had in mind. The biggest data set available for macroprudential policy intervention so far is the one gathered by Ceruti, Korea, and others, covering worldwide macroprudential policy incidents based on IMF survey. So they collected IMF survey. Their latest data set was when we started this study. Their latest data set ended in about I think 2013 or 2014. But they just recently updated the data set. So Charity et al. Has two different data sets. One is annual data sets and the second one is quarterly data set. The annual data set has just been updated to cover up to 2017, and the quarterly database is yet to be updated. I just met with Korea, one of the author of those papers, 2 weeks ago, and he mentioned to me that they will come up soon with the quarterly update data set. The data set is very nice because it comprehensively summarizes almost all, or at least all, the recorded macroprudential policy intervention around the globe, including those in Asia. But unfortunately, it only records the incident of macroprudential policy interventions without providing much more information on what's going on behind those interventions. So this is where we come in with the data set. The paper here did a lot of work in assembling a new data set based on Ceruti et al., which basically extend the coverage of the data set to include up to 2016. Actually, we do have up to 2017, but for reasons that I will explain to you in few slides to come, we stop our data set up to 2016, and then we also added few more countries based on our own exploration on documentations from authorities of different countries. And then the new thing that we added to the set of this kind of data set is that we match every incident of macroprudential policy intervention with the target indicator that the authorities were recording as the objective of those indicators. So suppose, for example, in the Ceruti et al. That they said, you will see, say, in Thailand, there is an LTV intervention in Q1 of, say, 2016, or in Q1 of, say, 2012. And that's where the data stopped in Ceruti et al. In our new assembled data set, we basically extended to see, in Q1 2012, Thailand authority is conducting an LTV intervention to target what? Either they target credit growth or credit growth in specific sector like housing or housing prices. So we go to the document that the central bank has here, the Bank of Thailand has here, or the whatever authority is responsible for that database, for the macroprudential policy intervention. And we try to discover what is the actual target indicators that this country is targeting for using that macroprudential policy, particular macroprudential policy intervention. So it's quite a lot of work, but we managed to get it done before ADO write-up. So we end up having this what I think a nice paper, but I don't know whether you agree with me. Anyway, so this paper also introduced the definition of effective macroprudential intervention, and then using that definition, we evaluate if there are macroeconomic conditions that could help in macroprudential interventions to be effective. This is a glance of our data set, basically. So most of the recorded interventions is coming in a form of reserve requirements, changes in reserve requirements. So as you see here, we group each interventions into a number of interventions that was conducted by specific regions. This dark blue line, that dark blue part of the bar here is giving you a number of interventions conducted by Asia and the Pacific emerging markets in between 2000 up to 2016. The gray part of the bar is the number of interventions conducted by emerging Europe, emerging European countries, and then the green bar here is the one is the number of macroprudential policy intervention, reserve requirements policy intervention conducted by the emerging American economies. Now, the other part is those conducted by the advanced economies. And we have we classify the type of macroprudential policy instruments into several different categories following what is already available in the database. Now, on the target side, we classify the target into 5 different categories. The first one is banking health in related target indicators. Second one is specifically domestic loans target indicators, and then there is an exchange rate target indicators, foreign capital movements target indicators. This is where macroprudential policy based on our and the available IMF definitions have some overlap with capital control later. And the last one is house prices. Right. So within the banking sector, we look at the bank asset, bank capital, because these are the indicators that basically reported in the authorities' report document. Domestic loans, we have starting from automobiles, consumer loans, credit to GDP ratio, and so on and so forth, including loans to the housing sector. Exchange rate is just targeting the exchange rate. Foreign capital movements, we have external debt, and so on and so forth. And then for housing, we have both house prices or residential property prices, depending on how the reporting country defined the price for the property sector. And then, if we look at the whole sample, this is what happened. We managed to collect about 1,300 something, almost 1,400 incidents of macroprudential policy intervention between 2000 to 2016. If we divide it into 2 different episodes, before and after the global financial crisis, most of the interventions were conducted after the financial crisis, after the global financial crisis, about 65% of them. And then in both cases, before and after the global financial crisis, the macroprudential policy interventions are mostly done to target domestic loans. But when we divide the domestic loans into housing-related and non-housing related lendings, we found out that there is still quite a bit of part of the lending, domestic credit category goes into targeting the housing-related lending. So if we add this part of housing-related lending into the part of those interventions that target specifically at house prices, then we can see most of the macroprudential policy interventions globally is conducted to target the housing sector. That is true before the global financial crisis and comes out to be more obvious in the episode after the global financial crisis. When we look at just on our Asia sample, same things come up. So most of the macroprudential policy intervention is conducted after the global financial crisis, and the biggest chunk of those interventions are conducted to target the housing-related sector. So that's what happened in the data set. And then on top of that, Asia is also found to be one of the most active user of this macroprudential policy intervention. Within our data sample, Asia occupies about 44% of the total macroprudential policy intervention recorded by the data. The data also has identified the easing and the tightening of macroprudential policy measures. So, frequency of reported policy actions by the resulting impact of the action. We found that most of the actions or most of the policy interventions are in the form of tightening macroprudential policy rather than easing macroprudential policy. And then if we break them up into different instruments, we see that the instruments that underwent a lot of easings are just the reserve requirements. The other instruments are mostly come up in the form of tightening instead of loosening. This is the interventions by region. So we have emerging Asia here, the blue part of the bars, and then we have Europe, the green part of the bars, and then America, the dark blue. Sorry. Asia is the green part of the bar, blue part is the Europe part of the bar, and then the dark blue part is the American part of the bar. So that's what we have. And by the way, Asia we have includes China, Georgia, Hong Kong, India, Indonesia, Kazakhstan, Korea, Malaysia, Mongolia, Pakistan, Philippines, Singapore, Sri Lanka, Taiwan, Thailand, and Vietnam. Plus advanced economies that includes Australia and New Zealand. Question might arise then why Japan is not here in the sample. If we go through the Ceruti et al. Database, then we will see that in between 2000 up to 2013, there are 2 incidents of macroprudential policy interventions reported for Japan. But when we come through the data and try to collect the documentations that related to those 2 different policies, apparently the 2 policies were just conducted in order to follow the changes from the BIS requirements. So in our view, those 2 incidents should not really be categorized as macroprudential policy interventions. It's just an action to compromise with requirements from the Bank of International Settlements. So that's why Japan is not here in our sample. This is quite a rich database, and we can do a lot of different stuff with it. Now, the first thing we do is how do we define effectiveness using the database that we have collected so far. Generally, an intervention that is followed by a decline of volatility would be defined as effective in our definition. This comes out of the fact that macroprudential policy in general is conducted in order to stabilize different segments of the markets, financial markets in particular. So that's how many defines the target of macroprudential policy intervention. And we take this definition into a numerical representation and interpret it as an ability of the policy to decrease the volatility of whatever target indicators that it's targeting. So, for example, if an LTV is conducted in order to stabilize housing prices, then we would like to see that the volatility of the housing prices decrease after an intervention. And if the volatility of the housing prices decrease sufficiently after an intervention, then we would categorize that intervention as effective or successful. Not, then we categorize it as otherwise. This is something that perhaps a little ad hoc in terms of nature, but it's still something that is worth to be explored, we think. So, how do we do it in practice? Basically, we take the pre-intervention volatility measured as an average of backward intervention, backward 1 year standard deviations. So, for example, if this is time t, if time t here is the point where the intervention is taking place, then we collected data for 12-month data before time t, that is time t minus 1 back to time t minus 12, and so on. So we collected 12 months of data for time t minus 1, for time t minus 1, time t minus 2, up to time t minus 6. So we collected the time series of the target indicators from time t minus 1 down to t minus 17. And then for each time t minus 1 up to t minus 6, we computed the standard 12-month standard deviation of them. And then once we got the 12-month standard deviation for time t minus 1 up to time t minus 6, we averaged them and used them as a measure of the average standard deviation of the target variable before the macroprudential policy intervention takes place. And then we do the same thing, but forward this time, for the period after the policy intervention. So we do this just to make sure that we don't have overlapping data from before and after macroprudential policy intervention is done. So now we do 12-month forward, we compute the 12-month forward standard deviation of time t plus 1 up to time t plus 6. This is why basically we stop our data set up to 2016, because we will not be able to gather the macroprudential, the target of macroprudential policy indicators, series 4 data in 2017 onwards. We will not have enough forward observations to compute the standard deviations basically. When we stop at 2016, we still have enough data points to compute the standard deviation. And that's basically why our data set stops at 2016 at this point. Right? Now, once we compute the average 6-month standard deviation before the intervention and average 6-month standard deviation after the intervention, then we compare these two standard deviation. Now, based on the whole sample, this table here is giving you the standard deviation measures based on the distribution of the standard deviation measures based on different quartiles. In our bottom quartiles, basically the average standard deviation before the intervention tend to be smaller than those observed after the interventions. So those that belongs in this bottom quartile in our data set and definition would be categorized as non-successful intervention, because instead of lowering the volatility of the target indicators, the interventions tend to increase the volatility of target indicators, which based on the definition laid down in the literature, we conclude that this is going against whatever the objective of the macroprudential policy intervention is, be it loosening or tightening. And then at the median, now we start seeing that the macroprudential policy intervention, the standard deviations or the volatility of the target indicators of macroprudential policy interventions started to decline after the interventions. In the whole sample, volatility before the interventions tend to be about 1.15 higher than those found after the interventions. And for the developing countries or for the emerging markets, developing Asia are the ones, the developing Asia samples are the ones that comes up with the highest declines. In this case, at the median age, the volatility before the intervention is about 1.17 or 1.2% higher than, so 1.2 times higher than the volatility after the intervention. The last column here gives you what happens in the top quartile. Latin America in the top quartile is the one that has the most decline in this kind of intervention. Now, to define the baseline of effectiveness of macroprudential policy intervention, we use a ratio of 1:5 in our analysis. That is the average standard deviation before, so the average standard deviation after policy intervention will decline by about 20% from the one we observed before the policy interventions. That's the baseline we do. Using that baseline, using that particular definition, then we start to compute percentage of successes given the state of output gap. So in the overall data that we've collected so far, percentage of successes in the sense that standard deviation or volatility of the target indicators declined by 20% after the policy intervention is less than 50%. So not all macroprudential policy interventions that is recorded in our database gives you a successful outcome. And then it also says here that most successes is observed, or more successes is observed when the output gap is negative, and not when the output gap is positive. So that's basically what we find and what we can do using the database so far. However, analyzing the data this way will give you some sort of biases because one can argue that when you observe a negative output gap, there might be some other indicators that also affect the successfulness or the unsuccessfulness of the macroprudential policy intervention in reducing volatility of the target indicators. So based on that, we start going for a regression analysis instead. We evaluate macroeconomic conditions that might affect the effectiveness of macroprudential policy interventions. In doing so, we look at several different set of indicators. The first two indicators here are the belongs to the group of macroprudential policy stance according to our definitions. So the first one here is the number of macroprudential policy interventions conducted within the same quarter So if we have one, that basically means that within that quarter, only one macroprudential policy intervention is conducted. And then when the number goes up, that means that the number of macroprudential policy intervention within that quarter is going up as well. The second one is the cumulative intervention index. So basically what we do here is we accumulate the number of policy tightening, macroprudential policy tightening take place within that particular month. So within that particular quarter. So if macroprudential policy was tightened in a four-quarter in T-4, and then tighten again in T-3, and then tighten again in T-2, tighten again in T-1, and then tighten again at time T, then basically the indicators of cumulative intervention at time T will give you a number of 5 because there were 5 tightening takes place before time T, and so on and so forth. Now, if suppose it was tightened on T-4, T-3, and then it was loosened in T-2 and T-1, then basically we subtract the loosening from the tightening. So by time T, there was no action on the policy interventions, the cumulative intervention index would be 0. That's how we define these two indicators. Now the two indicators basically gives you a sense of how the stance of macroprudential policy interventions was in a particular quarter. So when we control for the effectiveness of macroprudential policy intervention, just based on those two indicators, we find that the number of interventions has a positive outcome and the cumulative intervention index has a negative outcome. This basically means that, by the way, this is a profit estimation, so it's a probabilistic regression model. So basically this means that when you have more macroprudential policy intervention takes place at the same quarter, the chances of these policy of the macroprudential policy interventions to be effective is going to be higher, right? Higher chances of macroprudential policy interventions going to be effective if there are multiple number of interventions going on within the same quarter. And then, but if there are too many, or if there are more tightening takes place before that intervention, then the chances for that particular policy interventions to be effective is going to decline. It's going to be lower. Perhaps this is because of the too many tightening might consume the credibility of that policy itself in performing to stabilize its target indicators. But then again, we don't stop just there because we also think that some other macroeconomic conditions might have an effect on this. To do that, we then take an output gap as a measure of internal balance indicators, and then we take the credit cycles indicators in order to measure the state of the financial sector in the economy. And then we also take changes in external debt in order to see how changes in external dependence might affect the economy. And we also look at current account deviation from trend in order to get some indications on how a status of an economy as a net external borrowing or borrower or a net external lender might affect its chances to deliver effective macroprudential policy interventions. The other indicators that we're looking at is a change in the VIX index to measure changes in the stability of international financial markets, or to get some measure of external financial shocks to the economy. Once we take those indicators into account, we get this robust and significant results for all the indicators that I just mentioned. Basically, output gap lag comes up with a negative and significant coefficient, which suggests that when the output gap is positive, then the chances for macroprudential policy interventions to be effective is going to be lower than if the output gap is negative. Right? Credit cycle on the other side is going a different way. When you have a positive credit cycle, basically credit growing above its average or above its trend, you will have more chances to get an effective macroprudential interventions, and the other way around when credit is slowing. Changes in external debt also have the same implication of a credit cycle. This basically suggests to us that the chances to get an effective macroprudential policy interventions is going to be more if an economy is on a financial boom, regardless of the sources of financing of that financial boom. Either both domestic and external induced financial boom will provide a better environment for macroprudential policy intervention to become successful. That also that is also supported by the results found for the current account deviation. So surplus current account will tend to give a more positive, would tend to improve the chances for macroprudential policy intervention to be successful. What does this mean? When you have a current account surplus, then basically your economy is a net lender to the global economy. So when you don't have too much dependence on the external sector, then basically you have more independence to get your macroprudential policy intervention to become effective. An international shocks through changes in the VIX have a negative results. Then basically when international financial market is unstable, you will tend to have less chances to see macroprudential policy intervention to become effective. In the third column, we add a change in the monetary, a change in the interest policy interest rates. It came up significant and negative, which suggests to us that a tightening of monetary policy, if conducted together or at the same time with a changes in macroprudential policy, might overwhelm the effectiveness of macroprudential policy. So this is something or some indications about how monetary policy needs to be well coordinated with macroprudential policy intervention. It could not just be stand alone independently. But when we see other indicators, other policy indicators like fiscal policy and exchange rate policy, we don't find any significance there, suggesting that macroprudential policy interventions, the effectiveness of macroprudential policy interventions seems to be disassociated with whether or not fiscal policy is taking any specific actions, as well as whether or not exchange rate is taking specific action. Now, one thing that is interesting out of those additional indicators is whenever we add new indicators, the magnitude and the sign of estimates for the main set of indicators that we have in the right-hand side is always become robust and significant without in both signs and magnitude. So this is something that is encouraging to us, that the baseline specification we have here in column 2 seems to be robust, right? And then we do the marginal effects of probit, logit, and linear probability model in order to check whether our results is not robust as regards to the estimation methodology. Now, probit, logit, and LPM has different mechanism of estimates, and because of that, we have to compare the marginal effects instead of the actual estimate of the results. Now, when we do that, then we compute the average marginal effects for both probit and logit, and then the linear probabilistic model gives in column 3 is just regression results of that linear probabilistic model, because the coefficient we get out of the LPM is going to be the marginal effect of each indicators anyway, right? So when we do this, then as we can see, the first, second, and third columns give you a same magnitude, same signs with a very similar magnitude. So the number of interventions basically gives you about 0.03. Regardless of whether you are looking at a probit estimation results, a logit estimation results, or an LPM results. In the LPM, however, it didn't come up significant at alpha equals to 10%, but it's just marginally above 10%, so we include them here anyway. Now, what this suggests to us is that when a number of intervention is increased by 1 unit, so if there is additional intervention in the same quarter, then the probability or the chances of macroprudential policy intervention to become effective will increase by about 3 percentage points. That's what this is suggesting. Cumulative intervention index is also similar. The average marginal effects is much smaller than the number of interventions, but it is also robust in terms of both signs and magnitude. So these cumulative intervention index will tend to reduce the probability of macroprudential policy intervention to become effective by 0.1 percentage point. Output gap also the same. The effect is about minus 0.5. Credit cycle lags is about 0.4, and then in all different estimation method, changes in external debt will change the probability of effective macroprudential intervention by about 0.1 percentage point. Current account variation give you about 1.2 percentage point changes in the probability for successful macroprudential policy intervention. And same thing for PI. So based on this comparison, then we felt comfortable that regardless of the method of estimation that we do, we will end up with the similar, pretty much the same results anyway. So we just go with our probit estimations, the thing that we did earlier on, and check for other robustness size of the estimation. Now, what we do here is that to anticipate the questions on why do you pick 0.125 as your benchmark or as your baseline cutoff indicators to define effective intervention. We play around with the different benchmark here. The first and second columns give you the progression results if we use if we use the cutoff point of 1.1%, 1.1, meaning that the average volatility before intervention is 1.1 higher than average volatility after intervention. And then column 3 and 4 gives you a higher bar. Basically, where we look at average volatility before intervention is 1.5 times higher than after the intervention. And column 5 and 6 is giving you an even higher bar by looking at whether the volatility before the intervention is twice as much as those observed after the intervention. Now, when you look at these different bars, then you can see that number of intervention apparently only matters until the baseline cutoff point. When we consider higher cutoff point, like 1.5 or 2, the number of intervention does not come up significant anymore. And if you look at the statistical significance of these particular indicator, it comes up very significant for a lower bar, 1.1, and then it comes to become less significant in in our baseline 1.25, and it came up insignificant in the higher bars like 1.5 and 2. Cumulative intervention index, on the other hand, comes up significant when we consider a higher bar. When we consider a lower bar, 1.1, it doesn't come up significant. That's few of interesting observations that we did when we do this robustness check. And then the effect of the cumulative intervention index in penalizing the chances for effective macroprudential policy intervention is also increased by the increase in the bar itself. Right? Output gap comes up robust and significant regardless of the bar we have. 1.1, 1.25, 1.1, 1.5, and 2 all come up significant with a negative sign. The magnitude is higher for the lower bar and the higher bar, and tends to be slightly lower for the intermediate bars, basically. Credit cycle, it also came robustly. The magnitude of effect on probability for success does not change much. It's about the same. Same thing for changes in external debt as well as the current account deviation. So for the financial indicators here, seems that regardless of whether or not you are standing at a higher bar or a lower bar for defining your success, for defining the successfulness of your monetary policy, macroprudential policy intervention, they all matter with the same, with about the same magnitude anyway. So this is the thing that we observe from the robustness check when we play around with the different bars for defining effective intervention. Some additional results that we add here is that we add few more indicators on top of our baseline specifications. Just to recap, the baseline specification basically consists of those number of interventions, cumulative intervention index, output gap lag, credit cycle lag, changes in external debt, current account deviation, and changes in the VIX. Now, we add an additional dummy here, the pre-GFC dummy. Came up significant and positive. So basically, before the global financial crisis, chances for effective macroprudential policy interventions tend to be less than after the global financial crisis. This is consistent with the fact that the interconnectedness of the financial sector globally is actually increased after the global financial crisis. Whether or not tightening or loosening matters in affecting the successfulness of macroprudential policy interventions. We test this on the second column. It doesn't come up significant. So at least we don't see any evidence that tightening or loosening matters in affecting the chances for macroprudential policy interventions to be successful. Same thing when we observe and when we analyze about whether or not reserve requirement instruments have a different effect on successful macroprudential policy intervention. Why we are interested on this is simply because based on our sample, the reserve requirements is the one that occupy the most of observation we have. Anyway, so pre-GFC dummy is the only one that's significant. Another thing that we try to do here is to see whether the application of macroprudential policy intervention differ between advanced economies and emerging markets. It came out that the application of macroprudential, the effectiveness of the macroprudential policy application different between advanced economies and emerging markets. In the advanced economies, the chances of successful macroprudential policy interventions tend to be higher than in emerging market economies. On credit cycle lag, however, credit cycle does not affect the chances for successful macroprudential policy intervention. In advanced economies, credit cycle does not affect the chances for successful macroprudential policy intervention as much as those observed in the emerging markets. Same thing also happens for the changes in external debt as well as changes in the VIX. So based on these results, we also conclude that the behavior of successful macroprudential policy interventions in the advanced markets tend to be different than those observed for the emerging markets, particularly when it comes to financial sector conditions. In summary, macroprudential policy intervention is more likely to be effective when there is a multiple measure of interventions implemented in the same quarter. When there is an excessive macroprudential policy tightening in the past, this is avoided. And when the economy is in a slowdown, or when there is a build-up of excessive credit, there is a build-up of external debt, and when the economy is more of an external lender, and also when the economy is facing an increase in volatility. So those are the summary of results that we get out of the different exercise, and these summaries, of course, will lead us into some policy implications of how to navigate effective macroprudential policy interventions in the future. Thank you very much.
So thank you, Alif. Alif provided insightful about how macroprudentials can effective, and Alif talked about LTV. So it means that Thailand have the macroprudentials in terms of the cap on loan to value on the highest residential properties. Right now it's around 80% that they will provide loans to the properties that capped 80%. So I think that you might have some questions to ask Alif. I would like to ask you to keep the questions at the end of the sessions. Now I will present about the capital flows, and then if you have the questions, both of us will answer at the end of the sessions. So it is a work that I work for Alif for the Asian Development Outlook. It's about the capital account policy in emerging Asian countries. The question is, are they effective in the new millennium? So why this topic is interesting? So if you look back in the 1990s, most economies and international organizations, including the IMF, encouraged the member country to liberalize the capital and financial account, and this includes Thailand. However, due to the million financial crisis, especially for the crisis in developed countries in 2008, the usefulness of the capital account policy as a part of the toolbox to ensure macroeconomic stability have been revived. And IMF and other international organizations like the BIS or OECD call this as a capital flows management measure. And many countries in Asia, even in the high-income country that you will see later, like the Korea, have still implemented capital policy intensively. However, some economists like the Kim and Yang, Chow and Jones in 2016 still doubt upon the effectiveness of such a capital account policy as the toolbox. They argue that while trade and investment are still linked globally, you cannot control for the capital movement. Avoidance or evasion still occur or still exist. So capital account policy will not effective. So this is their argument. How about the empirical study? Mixed results still exist. Some find positives, recently flops 2016 for Brazil, and they have limited or no effects. When flops 2017 look at the cross country, they found that. So it means that they still have the mixed result between effectives or ineffectives. However, the most previous study tend to be outdated. They tend to stop the capital account policy before the global financial crisis, and they did not examine the possible substitutions and complementarity effects of the flows when they implement the capital control in one particular asset within the country and across countries, except for in 2016 that they look at the substitutions of the flows across country. So objective of this paper is to examine the effectiveness of the capital account policies to, first, they can change the volume of the capital flows or not. Second, they can change the composition of the capital flows toward the direct investment or not. In the paper, in fact, I also look at the effectiveness of the control in reducing the new exchange rate pressures and fostering the monetary independence. But with the presentations, I will provide you only the two objectives of the capital flows. So before we go to the effectiveness, we look for the definition first to lay down the same groundworks of understanding. So we use capital control, capital account policies, and recently capital flows measures interchangeably. For the capital account policies, capital flows measure is a policy that affects the cross-border capital flows, and they have two measures. One is called administrative measures. So it includes prohibitions. For example, indirect investment in Thailand, they have the Foreign Business Act in the list 3 that not allow the foreigner to have the majority shares, right, for the wholesale, retail, or the tourism. Or the quantitative restrictions, it not allow the money to flow in for some certain amount or outflow for some certain amounts. Or if you want to go out, you have to need the approval. Or if you want to bring money in, you need approval. So this is called administrative measures. And the other one is called market-based measures. So this one will provide additional cost for the transactions. For example, tax or reserve requirements. So we add the cost directly to the capital movement. And the capital account flow measure will have both two sides. You can do the control or you can liberalize. You can affect the inflows, you can affect the outflows, you can affect residents to bring money out or affect the non-resident to want to bring money into Thailand or other countries. And key objective of the capital account policy have 4 key objectives. One is to change the volumes and the compositions of capital flows toward the long-term capitals, like the direct investment. Second, to reduce the pressure of the exchange rate. Third, to fostering the monetary independence of the central bank. And fourth, to prevent the financial crisis. And capital flows management and macroprudential measure that Alif just presents, it overlap in some certain extent. If the capital flows management is designed to affect the capital flows and to address the systematic financial risk, for example, limit the bank's lending foreign exchange or limit the foreign exchange positions of the financial institutions. This we call macroprudential also. So it means some capital flow movement is the macroprudential, but not all capital flows management is the macroprudentials. So how about the capital flows in Asia? So I look capital flows in both ways. The first way is the flows that come to the Asian country, emerging Asian country. This is like the brown line here. This is flow that emerge from the non-resident that want to bring money in the countries. And the blue line here is the flows that the residents want to bring money out of the regions. So what you see from the inflow is foreign direct investment is still account for the substantial amount in the regions. But during the 2003 to 2007, there has a build-up of the other investment mostly in terms of the loans of the financial institutions and also the trade flow. So you will see the build-up of the brown bar here, and as well as for the debt, like a security inflow, like the red bar here. So this is a build-up during this period. And they have the significant decline of the flows during the 2013 and 2015. This occurred because of the Fed tend to increase the interest rate, and they have a doubt out on the growth of the Chinese economies. This one have the drop down also during the global financial crisis. The resident bring flow out of the region quite significant during the 2003 to 2007 and quite stable afterward. So with this kind of flow, what capital flow measure did in the regions? So I will give you some example. For example, in China, when they have the other investment flows come into the country during the 2003 to 2007, they did the capital inflow control. while try to discourage the inflows in the country. For example, try to set the ceiling on the domestic banks and foreign company borrowing from abroad. And during the 2013-2015, that they have the decline in the capital flow significantly here, they try to liberalize the non-residents and allow them to invest in the country easier, like reduce the overall limit of foreign investors to invest in the countries. And when they have the huge amount of foreigners or for the residents that want to bring money out of the country, they put the control again, but this is an outflow control that not allow the individual in the China to go to invest outside easily. They put the cap on the money that they can bring out. And if you extend 2018 quarter 2, you will see that the outflows quite significant from China, especially from the non-resident side. So non-resident want to bring money out from the China. What the central bank in China do is impose the 20% reserve requirement on foreign exchange forward sale. So not easily for the people to bring the foreign currency out of the country. This is what China did. How about Korea? For the high income country, they did some capital flow measure or not. So during the 2003 to 2007 that they have the build up of other investment, they not impose the control. What they do is they try to encourage the outflows from the country to out of the country easier to redress the pressure of the exchange rate. But what happened is during the global financial crisis, the other investment dropped down significantly, and capital flows that come into the Korea is become negative. So it means that non-residents bring money out of the country quite a big amount. So the line here is become negative, quite significant. So what happened is in 2011, when the central bank in Korea see the other investment flows coming to the country, quite big amount here, right? So the bar line here, I'm not quite sure you see or not. It's a bar here in here. So what the Korea did is Korea put the levy or impose the levy on the non-deposit foreign liability of the financial institute immediately, and tax on capital gains plus the interest on foreign bonds, right? Investments have been revived. And 2015, when the other investment become lower, they tend to loosen the capital control that they imposed during the 2011. So Korea still have the capital flow measure. How about Thailand? So Thailand, what you see is during the 2003 to 2006, Thailand also imposed the controls on the non-residents, not allow non-residents to bring the money in the country easily. It began in 2003, 2005. For example, try to limit the total daily outstanding balance of the non-resident bank account. And 2006 here, Thailand imposed the reserve requirement 30%. 2007, 2008, control relaxed, try to liberalize the control, and 2008 try to lift the reserve requirements. During this period, what Thailand did for the resident is allow the resident to bring money out easier, try to increase both player that can go to invest outside and the amount that the investor can bring money out of the country. But after the flooding in 2011, that you can see the significance of the drop down here in 2011. Here in the capital flows that come into Thailand. What Thailand did is Thailand have announced the capital account liberalization's master plan in 2012, and master plan here will affect both resident and non-resident. So it means resident can bring money in easily, and non-resident can bring money in easily, and resident can bring money out easily. So this is the liberalization plans forward here. This is capital flows measures in Thailand. Philippines, what happened to Philippines? So Philippines, when they have the build up of other investment here that I mentioned in 2007, Philippines do some capital flow measure by commercial bank imposed the cap under which local bank could sell dollar against peso. So they try to impose the outflows control here, with the aim that if they control for the outflow, that not easily to bring the money out of the country. It hoped that the money into the country will be limited also. Not sure that we will see later, but not sure that this is because of the measure or because of others fundamental in Philippines. The composition of Philippines in terms of the inflows that come into the country changed after the 2012. So right now, most of the capitals is in the yellow bar. Yellow bar is a foreign direct investment, and in 2017, it account almost 90% of the flows that come to Philippines. How about Indonesia? Last one that I would like to give in detail. Indonesia also did a lot of capital flows measure also. For example, in 2008, when they see the build up of the other investment bar here and the debt security, they put the restriction on purchase of foreign currencies against rupee, basing on underlying transactions. So they have the capital inflows control here. And with the build up of the debt security in 2009, they try to have the capital inflows control on debt security. So they introduced a month holding period of short-term central bank certificates. Before that, don't have any control on the period that they have to hold, right? And try to shift the maturity structure of the certificate to be longer, to reduce the fluctuation of the debt security. Other countries, Hong Kong, Singapore, still liberalize the financial accounts mostly. Malaysia, after the financial crisis, liberalized capital accounts substantially. Vietnam, still in terms of the liberalizations, except 2007, 2009, that they saw the build up of the other investment and debt security. So they put the cap of 3% bank lending on the security, and tax on the security investor was being imposed. So what we look here is capital flows quite still volatile, and capital flow measure has been implemented in many countries. Thailand have the capital liberalized plans after the 2012 onwards. So this is what we saw for the capital flows measures. And to examine the effectiveness of the capital account policy or capital flows measure, the key thing that we have to do is we have to look how to measure the capital controls. So we have three ways to measure the capital control. The first one is use the 0-1 dummy variable. This one is the easiest way to do. So when the period that have the control, we put 1. Otherwise, we put 0. But the disadvantage of this way is if you have multiple capital controls is going on, it's rather difficult to distinguish the effects of the control. For example, if you have the control on direct investment that imposed simultaneously with the control on equity and control on the other asset category, 0-1 is, when you put the 0-1, it's rather difficult to distinguish the effects. The second one, you use time series like the univariate structural models to find the outliner of the capital flows and tend to match with the capital control that exists. The same disadvantage as 0 and 1, if the capital flow measure have been imposed quite a lot, you cannot distinguish the effects of the capital flows measure. The last one is you construct the capital control index. And you have two ways to construct the capital control index. First one, you use the information from the local central banks. So you get the detail of the capital flows measure. And this one, most of the study that did for this one is tend to be the cross-country analysis, because it have to get the information from the central bank, and it's rather difficult to do in terms of the cross-country analysis. For the cross-country analysis, most of the study will use the information from the IMF annual report on exchange arrangement and exchange restrictions, or ARER here. So Fernandez 2016 is the one that conducts the capital flows measures from the this kind of annual report from the IMF also. What they do for the Fernandez is they divide the asset category into the, for example, direct investment, portfolio investment, equity, debt, and other investment. And they divide each asset according to inflows or outflows, and then according to resident or non-residents. And after that, they will assign 0 ones, and 0 being the least restrictive, and 1 is the most restrictive to the capital controls. And the word that we see as a control is when you see authorizations, approval, permissions, clearance, you have the ceilings, and you have the market-based control like the tax or the URR, right? So, and this one is the measures that we get from the annual report of the IMF. So you will see that the restrictions mostly in China, India, and in the Singapore and Hong Kong, the restriction is quite less in terms of the both inflows and outflows. So now we have the capital control index. We want to see the effectiveness of these controls. What we do is we define first about the capital flows. So the capital flows composed of 2 parts. Capital flows come from here non-residents or liability. Non-resident that bring the money into the country, it means it become liability of Thailand. Plus the resident that bring money back from invest outside. So this is called inflows. For outflows, it means that they have the residents go to invest outside and non-residents that want to bring money out of the country. So this is become the outflows in our study. So the baseline equations of our study will be the capital flows in terms of the inflows in the category K, right? In the category K, as a function of the capital restrictions and the control variables. Outflow is the same. Outflows as the functions of the control variable and of the control variable here and the capital flows measures. And we divide the capital inflows, capital outflows in 4 categories or 4 assets. One is direct investment, and another one is equity, debt security, and other investment that composing of loans and also trade credit in the other investment. And control variable here, we get the idea from the push and pull factor of the Cowell 1993 and subsequently expanded by Fernandez 1996 and Filler 2004. So for the control variable, we have the GDP per capita, financial developments, trade openness, the initial natural resource endowments in the country, good governance, exchange rate, risks, and real interest rate differentials to look at the real return of the countries. And the baseline equations is extend, as I mentioned, we try to look more than other literature that look. So we extend the baseline equations. So the first one, as I mentioned, inflow and outflows, we have both residents, non-residents. We would like to see whether the effective is come from resident or non-residents. So we separate the capital flow measure into the non-residents and capital flow measures in terms of the residents. And we look whether the effectiveness of the capital flow measure is asymmetric or not. So what we try to do is we introduce the dummy variable for the tightenings. It equal to 1 when the capital flows measure is tightened comparing to the previous period. And dummy for loosens when the capital flows or capital controls measure or capital flow management is loosened comparing to the previous periods. So asymmetric will occur when the alpha 2 years or alpha 3 years or both is significant. And the third one, we try to look for the capital inflows measure, capital outflows control will have the effects on the capital inflow movement or not. This is like the Philippines did that time to control for the outflows, control for the non-residents. This helped to reduce the volume of inflows or not. We try to look at the effectiveness in this sense also. And the next one, substitutions across asset. So we try to look whether, for example, this is the capital flows in terms of the direct investment. We put the direct measures of the direct investment here, and we tend to put the other measures or capital flows measure in other asset category. For example, equity, debt, and other investment. We will put the measure here to look whether they have the substitutions effects across the capital flows or not. And the fifth one, we try to look whether they have the substitutions effects across country or not. So we put the capital restrictions of its own country here, and we put the restrictions of other country here also. So we do by with the capital flows measure of other country by the GDP per capita, and also with by the share of its importance as a trade partners. And we also split or break down these capital flows measures here in terms of the regions. So we break down in terms of East Asia and also in the Southeast Asia also. So this is the equation that we will do to look at the volume of the flows. We have 10 emerging Asian countries, and we will do during the period 2000 to 2015 the latest data that we have for the capital flows measures. And since the lack of own capital flows matter, so we will use the dynamic panel models to address this kind of significant of lacks of capital flows, and we use both Arellano and bonds and bundle and bonds to estimate the equations, and we have both year and country dummy to include into the model. And note that we treat the exchange rate, GDP per capita, and also capital restrictions as the endogenous variable, because diagnostic and the over-identifications, when we treat this as an endogenous variable, yield a better result. So what we find? So in terms of the inflows, we find that not all. So what we find is not all capital flow measures is significant. The most significant is in terms of the direct investment and equity. That when you put controls on the direct investment, you tend to see the declines of the capital that come in terms of the direct investment, and this also in terms of equity, more significant in terms of debt and other investment. So why this occur? When we look at the measure, this might be the nature of the capital flows management that occur. So if we look the measure in terms of the direct investment and equity, most measure is in terms of limit the share of the foreign participations. While in terms of debt and other investment, the measure tend to be in terms of approval. So the judgment of authority tend to involve much in terms of the debt and other investment. So the significance tend to be less, or effectiveness tend to be less than this kind of two other flows. So asymmetric occur or not, we find that the asymmetric occur when we tend to lose the capital flows management. When we lose the capital flows management, the effectiveness tend to be higher. It means that more capital flows will come into the country. Resident and non-resident, the effects tend to be more on the non-resident, especially in terms of the equities. This might be because of the flows that come in terms of the inflows. Most of the time it come from the foreigner or the non-resident. So if you put the measure on the non-resident, the effectiveness tend to be higher. Outflows control, we not find any effectives of the outflows controls. This might be because after the Asian financial crisis, not much outflows control have been involved in the regions. most of the country try to liberalize the outflows control and allow the non-resident to bring money out easily. For the substitutions and complementarity effects, we find the complementarity effects among three folds. Direct investment and equity, for example, if we impose the control on the equity, it will bring the direct investment inflows decline also. The complementarity here happen might be because of the nature of the direct investment that changes toward more the merger and acquisitions, that the nature is tend to be quite similar to the equities flows. Debt security and equity, we find the complementarity also. So when we increase the debt controls, it tends to reduce the equity inflows also. We not find the significant complementarity or substitutions between debt and other investment. While in developing country, in many studies find the substitutions between these two flows. This might be because in Thailand, the secondary bond market still not developed well. So the debt and other investment here is still not like a substitute to each others. Interestingly, when we look the substitutions or complementarities across country, what we find is the positives like coefficients here. What does it mean? It means that when other countries impose the control on direct investment, more capital inflows in terms of direct investment will come into the country. So it means they compete to each other to get the direct investment inflows. But once we break down here, right, we break down the capital flow measure here into the East Asia and Southeast Asia. What we find that in Southeast Asia, they tend to compete to each other to get the flow. So we get the positive relationship the same. But in terms of the East Asia, we find the negative relationship or complementarity. So it means that if China put the control on the investment that come to Thailand will also decline also. This is what we found. But for the equity, debt and other, on average, we find that the flows tend to be complements across emerging Asian countries. If one country imposes the controls, it will reduce the equity, debt or other country into Thailand. But when we break down the capital flow measures in East Asia and Southeast Asia, what we find is we find substitutions in Southeast Asian country. So it means if Malaysia impose the controls in equity, equity will come to Thailand, Philippines and others. But if East Asia impose the control, we find the complementarity. So if China impose the controls on equity or Hong Kong impose the control on equity, the equity will come less to Thailand and other Southeast Asia also. So this is what we find in the estimations, and we extend after we get some comments. Yeah. And for the outflows here, not much effects has been found in terms of the capital flows measure. What we find is only in terms of the other investment and in terms of the investment. So when the central bank in Thailand try to liberalize the direct investment outflows or allow residents to invest outside easily, the effects from the flow or from the measure is quite mild or not significant much. What we find is the fundamentals seem to be more crucial to bring the money out of the countries. For example, in terms of direct investment, residents will decide to bring money out depend on the GDP per capita, depend on the trade openness of the country, depend on the initial resource endowment of the countries. For the equity, debt and others, they will bring money out or residents will bring money out to invest outside. Fundamental that is important is the return, relative return between country and also in terms of the risk that we measure by risk index. Asymmetric, we not found much. Resident, non-resident, we not find the result much. So for the inflows, we find the significant only in terms of the equities. Substitutions, we not find the result much. The thing that we find is in terms of direct investment and equities. So this could be because of the nature of direct investment and equity that become quite close to each other. Because direct investment is more in terms of the merger and acquisition now. And substitution across country is also limited, also comparing to the inflows. So this is what we find from our study. The second one that we looked at, we would like to look at capital flows measure can change the composition of flows toward the direct investment or not. What we find that the only debt securities that have the really significant impacts in changing the compositions toward the long-term capitals. Other investments have the mild impacts, right, around 15% to change the compositions of the flows toward the foreign direct investment. What we find the significant is the fundamentals of the countries matter quite significant to change the compositions of the flows. And the fundamentals is in terms of the good governance, in terms of the political stability, reductions in the corruptions, and in terms of democratic spheres, and the GDP per capita is also that quite significant, and financial developments. And another one is the returns that have the negative sides. It means that if Thailand have the high returns, more flows that comes, it will be in terms of the equity, debt, and other investment rather than the direct investments. Trade openness, we find only mild results. When we have the trade openness, we have the direct investment. But what happened is we have increase in trade credit also. The trade credit will be in the other investment inflows. So the proportions of the direct investment that come from the trade openness will be quite limited. So conclusions and influence. After the new millenniums, capital flow measures still implement in emerging Asian countries. So for the inflow side, the measures more in terms of the debt and other investment. The measure more in terms of try to reduce debt and other investment. For the outflows, most of the countries still tend to liberalize, except for the China in 2016-17 that put the control for the resident, not allow the resident to bring money out easily. Our results show that only some type of the capital control are effective, not all types. And the substitutions and complementarity among assets still evident, especially for the three assets, direct investment, equity, and debt security. And we find substitutions and complementarity not only within the country, but also across the countries. Control on debt help to change the composition of flows toward direct investment. But the fundamentals seem to be more crucial to change the compositions of the flows. For outflows, only some types of the liberalizations policy help to stimulate the outflow from the countries. But fundamental of the host and home country seem to be more crucial to change the composition of flows. So, with the effectiveness of the capital flow measure that we have, we conclude that the capital flow measure still be or could be the tools from the central banks to limit or to get the macro stabilities. But once you implement the capital flows measure, you have to done with cautions because you have the cost of interventions. You have the substitutions and complementarity within the country in terms of the across asset and also across regions, across country in the regions. And when you have the substitutions or complementarity across country, this implies that coordinations within the region still important to ensure the stability in emerging Asian country or in Asia. I would like to end my presentations here. So when you look for the Malaysia, and I say that Malaysia is did the liberalizations after the Asian financial crisis. So if you look the short-term debt to total reserve in Malaysia, this is Malaysia here. In 1997, this is short-term debt to total reserve. Now you look short-term debt to total reserve in Malaysia, it's here. After the liberalizations, it includes to around 80%. So this is the thing that I think the central bank need to monitor closely about the short-term debt of the Malaysia. Thailand that have the capital liberalization master plan in 2012. I think we need to closely monitor about the capital flow movement in Thailand. Even though right now the short-term debt to total reserve is still limit, but as in our legations, substitutions across Southeast Asian countries still exist, and if other countries in the Southeast Asia ready to implement the capital flows measure, capital liberalizations plan in Thailand here need to monitor closely to ensure that we will not have the short-term debt to GDP increase significantly like the Malaysia now. So thank you so much for the your attendance today. So I would like to bring Alif here.
Can I ask something about
Yes.
this short-term debt is just the one under portfolio, or is it also included the one that goes to the banking sector?
Go to the banking sector.
This one is under other investments.
Yes, also, right? So this is like a short-term debt that have both in the debt and the other investments. Yeah. So I would like to open the floors for the questions you can ask Alif. What about the macroprudentials and other capital flow measure? Alif can also answer the questions.
First, thanks, Alif, for the very good presentation. In your regression analysis, I wonder about the rational or the variable like output gap and credit cycle, which are supposed to be a primary indicator for imposing any macroprudential. Let's say if you found that output gap is too close to the potential, it's like it's a heating, economy is heating, or you likely to experience the bubble economy, and then you try to impose kind of macroprudential to guard against any bubble circle like that. But in your regression, you put these two variables as a determinants of macroprudential effectiveness. I wonder how can you, what is your economic rationale to set up this equation? Thank you.
Thank you. So basically, how we put this output gap and credit cycles into regression is by lag. It's not directly. So what we want to get out of this is that is the macro conditions, is the prevailing macro conditions helpful in helping to determine whether or not the macroprudential policy is going to be effective. That's where we're coming from with this. And then the initial setup was actually think about a general equilibrium type of model where macroprudential policy is part of a policy lever that can be fit in. But when we come up into that question about modeling, and we start thinking about, hang on, we don't know exactly how these things are related. So that's basically where we go with this empirical approach to begin with. Now, output gap and credit cycle might be the objective of the macroprudential policy interventions, as you said. But at the same time, it is also provided the conditions to which a macroprudential policy intervention operates to affect the economy, right? So that's basically why we are putting a lag on that instead of the contemporaneous one, the regression. So it's a prevailing conditions before intervention is taking place. And then does that prevailing conditions have any effect in helping the interventions to become effective or not? That's basically the rationale of it. Is that?
Thank you. Let me elaborate a little bit more. If that be the case, why not we try to introduce non-linear kind of like the lag upward gap square to see if it can capture to some extent the speed to introduce the macroprudential. For example, if you observe the output gap, actual output close to the potential, let's say, or close to the potential, and you try to introduce a macroprudential to solve it, right? But in some cases, you be too late. The actual output is far over the potential. If you mean the economy is heating, in that case, introduce macroprudential too late might not really effective. You can try. This is just a suggestion. Might be a naive suggestion. Let me think about it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Have other questions?
Okay, actually my questions are more directed at you and your little attempt to look at the differences and the effects of these measures on different types of capital flows. And as always, my concern surrounds the data. And in particular, I look at your sample and I notice that you have Hong Kong and Singapore in the same sample with all these developing economies. And particularly in the case of Hong Kong, for example, I think it's 60% of the outward direct investment goes to the Caribbean, and about 50% comes from the Caribbean. And these are huge flows. They dwarf anything in Thailand. And they're very often I hear stories about companies, they just keep bank accounts in the Cayman Islands, for example. And they use these for personal purposes as well as other purposes. And so the distinction, especially in Hong Kong and Singapore, between portfolio and direct investment capital is quite dubious, I think. That is to say, a very large portion of direct investment behaves just like portfolio investment because it's basically keeping bank accounts offshore, and then because these are small, mainly family businesses, a lot of times the money gets used for purposes other than running the MNE that has the bank accounts. And so I'm also thinking that I've noticed in Indonesia also, they're quite, especially of the inflows coming into Indonesia, a very large portion of them come from these tax havens. And I'm thinking that this is much more like portfolio capital. And it's moving money around to take advantages of differences in interest rates and differences in stock prices and so on. And in that case, I'm thinking it might be better to look at your regressions, without Hong Kong and Singapore in them as a robustness check. And I might even go farther and say, well, we'll take out Singapore as well. And then I'm always keen to see how Taiwan fits into this. So you might want to think about looking at Korea and Taiwan together, for example.
Yeah, thank you, Alex, for the comments. So for the Hong Kong and Singapore, when I did the regressions, I have two regressions. One is I include all, and the second one, I exclude the Hong Kong and Singapore because of the reasons that you mentioned. But I haven't delete Indonesia. Right? I always include Indonesia. The thing is that the results is still significant like this, but the coefficient is changed. Right? The coefficients, especially for the substitutions between direct and the equities, it become less. Yeah. So because of that result, I still keep the Singapore and Hong Kong in the report. Yeah, but as you suggest, I might add the results when these two countries has been deleted.
And you might think about a sample without Korea as well, because Korea in particular is quite different. And there's a lot of these, I don't know, what is it, the foreign capital funds have been investing in Korea, especially since the 97 crisis. So they actually do behave much more like portfolio investors. They buy companies, hold them for 2 or 3 years, and then sell them again.
Yeah, sure, Eric. I will try that. But what I would like to include Korea here because after the global financial crisis, Korea is the one that have a lot of capital flows measures going on. So I would like to know whether this effective or not. But as you suggest, I will try to bring the Korea out and see the result is still robust or not.
Instead of doing that, you might perhaps also introduce an interactive dummy that separates out Korea within the sample in one regression, so you don't lose out observations in that regression, but you treat Korea as a special case. That might be an alternative, I think.
Yeah, I think it's maybe better now, Eric, because our sample is not that big, so maybe we include the interaction terms to treat the Korea as a special case. Yeah. Thanks. So other questions?
Question about the Thammasat. The intervention here we're using number of intervention, but I'm curious about is it intervention has like a quality or scope or type difference that can explain something in the reducing the volatility.
Let's try again. The question is whether different type of interventions will affect the probability of successfulness of macroprudential policy. Yes, that's something that we have not been exploring in this particular exercise yet, because we want to start off with a very general thing first. It's a little overgeneralization. There is a little overgeneralization as we did in the paper. We don't differentiate between different macroprudential policy instruments. We don't differentiate between macroprudential policy targets. We just put them together at the same time and saying that every macroprudential policy intervention is trying to reduce volatility of its target. That's what. But what your suggestion is of course a potential way forward given the data. Thanks.
So other questions? So if not, I would like to thank Alif very much to come to our faculties and present the nice paper today. So I have some special gift for you, and I would like to ask or invite Eric to provide the gift to Alif.
Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you so much.